According to the psychological and scientific model, the majority of people in their waking day, in a normal day, spend about 70% of their time living in stress. And living in stress is living in survival. And the actual definition of stress is when your body's knocked out of homeostasis. Stress is when your body's knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. You have three types of stress. You have physical stress, like trauma, injuries, accidents, falls. You have chemical stress, like bacteria, viruses, blood sugar levels, heavy metals in food, hangovers, whatever. And you have emotional stress, like traffic jams, internet connections, second mortgages, single parenting, 401ks, family tragedies. All of those things knock the brain and body out of balance. Now, all organisms in nature can adapt to short-term stress. A pack of coyotes chases a deer in the forest. The deer outruns the coyotes. The stress is over. The deer returns back to homeostasis and it grazes again. The event is over. When the deer perceives a threat in its external environment, it turns on a primitive nervous system called the fight or flight nervous system. And that autonomic nervous system, that sympathetic nervous system, begins to mobilize enormous amounts of energy for some threat in the external environment. Now, deer has all its physiology changed, all the blood is sent to the extremities, heart rate increases, respiratory rate increases, pupils dilate. The 1,300 chemicals that are created in a matter of seconds is to cause the deer to survive in some difficult condition. Now, human beings have the same mechanisms. And when we perceive a threat in our external environment, like a lion, we are going to run or fight or freeze. But if you've had problems with your coworker, or you've had a very difficult experience with your mother-in-law, the moment you perceive your mother-in-law or your coworker, you have a past experience with them, you're going to turn on the same primitive nervous system, just like you were being chased by a lion. So what was once highly adaptive now becomes very maladaptive, because when you're mobilizing all of that energy, you are going to operate in very predictable ways. You're going to be an amped up animal with a big memory bank. So that your blood flow is going to go to the hindbrain and away from the forebrain, which means you're going to react instead of think, rationalize. But human beings, the privilege of being a human being is that we can make thought more real than anything else. That's the privilege. So then you can begin to forecast some future worst case scenario. And you can attend to that thought to the exclusion of everything else. And you can focus on it to such a degree that you will begin to anticipate the event and produce the same chemicals as if you were in that experience. And you're knocking your brain and body out of balance just by thought alone. You can begin to unfold some past bitter memory that's tattooed in the recesses of your gray matter. And like magic, you can bring it to life. In that moment, it's real. And you will produce the same chemistry in your brain and body as if that event occurred. And your body, as the unconscious mind, is literally living that experience. So then, when we're living by the hormones of stress, and you turn on that stress response, and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for some disease. Because no organism in nature can tolerate living in emergency mode for extended periods of time. So if 70% of the time a person's living in survival, living in stress, in survival, what we do in order to survive is we are going to select the worst case scenario. And we are going to begin to plan our behaviors and our emotions in that experience, because anything less than the worst case scenario means we have better chances of survival. So we plan for the worst, we emotionally embrace it, and anything less means we can survive. So out of the infinite potentials in the quantum field, anxiety really represents a poor imagination, but it's highly adaptive if you're living in survival, because you got to get ready for that. So 70% of the time, people are selecting the worst case event in their life and emotionally embracing it, and they're programming their autonomic nervous system into a very specific destiny. And it turns out if you keep doing that and you create the emotions of fear and worry and anxiety, and you do that for 10 years or 5 years or 3 years, your body is going to unconsciously become programmed to fear. And it's going to have a panic attack without you. Try as you may with your conscious mind to control it, you've programmed it subconsciously. And now the body, as the mind, is running the show. So, the hormones of stress create the emotions of anger, of aggression, of hostility, of violence, of frustration, of hatred, of fear, of anxiety, of guilt, of shame, of hopelessness, of powerlessness, depression. Those are all chemicals that are derived from the hormones of stress. And when we live by the hormones of stress, we become very selfish. Why? Because when you're in survival, you got to take care of the self. Your attention is on your body, right? Your attention is on your external environment. There's predators out there. The rush of adrenaline causes the senses to become heightened. You're a materialist, and you're trying to predict the future because there's better chances of survival. You can predict the future based on the past. When that occurs then, over time, the body begins to break down because it's a scientific fact that the hormones of stress downregulate genes to create disease in the long term. So if you can turn on the stress response just by thought alone, and the hormones of stress can make you sick, then your thoughts can literally make you sick. So the question is, if your thoughts can make you sick, is it possible then that your thoughts can make you well?
The formula that we teach, the formula is really about brain coherence and heart coherence. And when you're living driven by the hormones of stress and you're living in survival, and the rush of those chemicals causes, the arousal begins to cause you to feel more in your body, more like a body, more attention on your outer environment. That's where the danger is. And preoccupied with time. The arousal of those chemicals causes a person then to try to control and predict everything in their lives. Because they're experiencing a loss of control. They're experiencing the inability to predict the next moment. They have the perception that something's getting worse. And people spend 70% of the time living this way. And now they're shifting their attention to the one person, to the one problem, to the one place the problem exists, then back to work, and then to their boss, and to their coworkers, and then to their children, and to appointments. And every single one of those elements is already neurologically in their brain. There are neurological networks for every person, every object, everything, every place in their life. So then, as they shift their attention from one neurological network to the other, their brain begins to fire very incoherently. And the brain moves into an alert state called high beta brainwave patterns. And people get stuck in that state. And they overanalyze everything in their lives. And they drive their brain further and further into higher states of high beta. So then they're always preoccupied with what's going to happen in the next moment. And the majority of the time, they're thinking about the worst thing that could happen. And when you live in that state, you're combining a thought of the worst thing with the feeling of fear or anxiety. And here goes the conditioning process again. And so now the body's becoming conditioned to live off that rush of adrenaline. And the mind is stimulating the very circuits and chemicals to produce more of those emotions. And living in survival is living in stress. And it's not a time to eat. It's not a time to digest. It's not a time for long-term building projects. It's not a time to learn. It's not a time to open your heart. It's time to run, fight, or hide. And people live the majority of their lives this way. And their brain begins to fire very disorderly. And the stronger the emotion the person feels from whatever stressor is causing it in their environment, the more they narrow their focus on the cause. And they habituate into this type of focus called a narrow focus, focusing on objects, focusing on the material world, because the hormones of stress heighten the senses to cause us to become materialists. We don't see it, we don't smell it, we don't hear it, we don't taste it, we don't feel it, it doesn't exist. So we become materialists. We can't dream in that moment. It's more important to narrow your focus on matter, on the material world. And people get fixated and over-focused. And we found out that if you take a person and teach them how to do the exact opposite of that, instead of narrowing their focus this way and focusing on the material world, to broaden their focus and to focus on nothing. Take their attention off of everything material, off their body, off the people in their lives, off the objects, their cell phones, computers, their cars. Take their attention off the place they sleep, the place they work, the place they live, the place they're sitting, and take their attention off the predictable future and the familiar past. And broaden their focus and just keep opening their awareness to nothing. That all of a sudden, brain waves begin to slow down, because when they're sensing, they're not analyzing, they're not thinking. And the act of sensing begins to suppress the neocortex and starts to move into an alpha brainwave pattern. And then, if you do that properly, you can open your focus and keep it open. All of a sudden, those different parts of the brain that were fighting against each other start to synchronize. They start unifying. They start functioning in larger communities. And what syncs in the brain starts to link in the brain, and all of a sudden the brain starts firing in a more holistic state. And when your brain is incoherent, you're incoherent. And when your brain isn't working right, you're not working right. But all of a sudden now, they're beginning to connect to an invisible field of energy and information called the quantum field. And its signature, energetically, is greater and greater degrees of order, greater degrees of wholeness or oneness, less separation. And if you can teach a person how to connect to that field, they can't experience it with their senses. They understand that they experience this reality with their senses. They could only experience it as an awareness. When the person can get beyond their identity, without a name or a lifestyle or ethnicity or a diet or a profession, just could linger there as an awareness, that the longer they do that, the more they keep their attention on that field and less on matter, their biology begins to become more whole, becomes more orderly. And all of a sudden, they're connected to something greater. And the brain begins to synchronize. And when you see those two hemispheres coming together, you see a huge change in the person's heart. The union of polarities, the union of dualities, the union of opposites is called wholeness. It's called love. It's called oneness. And all of a sudden, energy moves right into the heart. And now, all that energy that was going from the brain and the heart into the lower centers of the body when the person was living in stress, all of a sudden, energy starts moving up into the heart. And once it makes it to the heart, the research shows over and over again, it goes right up to the brain. And now the heart is amplifying the brain. And so then, by teaching people how to create brain coherence, we've seen people move into heart coherence. We have spent many hours teaching our students, along with partnering with the Heart Math Institute, how to sustain heart coherence and to open their hearts. And not just for 5 minutes, not just for 10 minutes, not just for 15 minutes. We want them to be able to sustain it for 45 minutes or more. That they know how to do it. That they can create an elevated emotion on command. Because it is that emotion that connects them to a new future. Not the emotions, that are created from the hormones of stress. They keep us connected to the past.